Good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone. And on a night like this, and in times like these, I'd be remiss to say that it feels like, if I didn't say it, that it feels like a bit of an act of courage just to leave the house in the morning, let alone to come out again in the evening. So I am grateful to see you all tonight, and I promise that it'll be well worth your while. Prepare to be inspired and to engage with an incredibly important thinker and activist doing urgent work in these two dark times. My name is Khury Petersen-Smith. I am an activist and the Middle East Research Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. I want to thank the Landon Foundation for convening this special evening as part of an extraordinary speaker series. I also have to say, as a geographer, that I am very excited about the next speaker, too, which is on Wednesday, October 24th, David Harvey, who is a bit of a rock star in the world of radical geography. So come through for that, too. He will be here in conversation with journalist Laura Flanders. It is my distinct honor to introduce Reverend Barber. In these days and weeks, if you are concerned with social justice, economic justice, or our planet's ecology, and we recognize that each of those broad categories is tied to particular questions of racism, of the attack on women, something that I'm sure is always on our minds, but especially in these past few weeks. The horrendous attacks on migrants, and unfortunately the list could go on. There's plenty to be upset about and called to action around. Given that, I believe that there is an urgent need to have understandings, analyses, and action that not only appreciate and resist each particular attack, but that can also pull it all together as part of a deeper resistance. And Reverend Barber is truly one of the leaders in this country doing precisely that work. Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II is the president and senior lecturer of Repairers of the Breach. Repairers of the Breach is an organization that Reverend Barber founded. It works nationally to advance a moral agenda that uplifts our deepest constitutional and moral values of love, justice, and mercy. I will read from a statement from Repairers of the Breach. We declare that the moral public concerns of our faith traditions are how our society treats the poor, women, LGBTQ people, children, workers, immigrants, communities of color, and the sick, the people whom Jesus calls the least of these. Our moral traditions point to equal protection under the law, the desire for peace within and among nations, the dignity of all people, and the responsibility to care for our common home. Reverend Barber is also the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. The campaign is inspired by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's 1968 Poor People's Campaign and has reached out to communities in more than 30 states across this country. The campaign has met with tens of thousands of people witnessing the strength of their moral courage in trying times. It has gathered testimonies from hundreds of poor people and has chronicled their demands for a better society. It has produced a report, along with my colleagues at the Institute for Policy Study, called The Souls of Poor Folk, Auditing America, which reveals how the evils of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, and the war economy and militarism are persistent, pervasive, and perpetuated by a distorted moral narrative that must be challenged. Reverend Barber is a bishop with the College of Affirming Bishops and Faith Leaders. He comes to us from Goldsboro, North Carolina, where he is the pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. Reverend Barber received his bachelor's degree in political science from North Carolina Central University, a Master of Divinity degree from Duke, and a doctorate from Drew University in public policy and pastoral care. He is the author of 3 books, Revive Us Again, Vision and Action in Moral Organizing, The Third Reconstruction, Moral Mondays, Fusion Politics, and the Rise of a New Justice Movement, and Forward Together, a moral message for the nation. Dr. Barber is also the architect of the Forward Together moral movement that garnered national attention with its Moral Mondays protests at the North Carolina General Assembly in 2013. These weekly actions drew tens of thousands of North Carolinians and other moral witnesses to the state legislature. More than 1,200 peaceful protesters were arrested, handcuffed, and jailed. On September 12, 2016, Reverend Barber led a Moral Day of Action, the largest coordinated action on state capitals in US history, calling for state governments to embrace a moral public policy agenda. On February 11, 2017, he led the largest moral march in North Carolina state history with over 80,000 people calling on the state's elected officials to embrace a moral public policy agenda. Reverend Barber served as the president of North Carolina's NAACP, the largest in the South, from 2006 to 2017, and he currently sits on the National NAACP Board of Directors. A former Mel King Fellow at MIT, he is currently visiting professor of public theology and activism at Union Theological Seminary and is a senior fellow at the Auburn Seminary. He is a contributing op-ed writer to the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, and the Washington Post. He is the 2015 recipient of the Puffin Award and the Franklin D. Roosevelt Four Freedoms Award. This year, Reverend Barber was named by The Guardian one of the Frederick Douglass 200, which is, on the occasion of his bicentennial, a list of 200 people who best embody the spirit and work of the famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass. That list of 200 people includes categories from politicians to diplomats. Reverend Barber was listed under abolitionists. And finally, just recently, Reverend Barber was named one of the 2018 MacArthur Fellows by the MacArthur Foundation. Sounds like most of you have heard of that, but it is better known by its nickname, the MacArthur Genius Award. In granting the award, the MacArthur Foundation declared, "Merging moral and activist traditions, Reverend Barber is providing a faith-based framework for action that strengthens civic engagement and inspires the country to imagine a more humane society." Please join me in welcoming Reverend Barber.
Good evening. Good evening. It's so good to be with you here in Santa Fe. Amen. While you're standing, would you say with me, forward together? Not one step back. Forward together. Not one step back. Thank you so much tonight. Thank you so much. It is such a privilege to be here with you. I am so humbled and honored. I ask God's grace tonight to be able to sustain me for this place, this moment, this time. I'm so thankful to the Lannan Foundation for their gracious invitation, all of those who've had something to do with it. I often tell the story, being a country boy, that when I come to places like this, it's kind of like the man that entered his mule into the Kentucky Derby. And you can bring this up a little bit. And somebody asked him, "Why would you put your mule in the Kentucky Derby? He can't beat those thoroughbreds, and by the time they're out of the gate, he'll be still in the gate." He said, "I know that." "Well, why would you pay the $10,000, $20,000 entry fee for him to come, knowing he's going to lose?" And the man said, "Well, I'm doing it because I thought the exposure might do him some good." So I'm glad the Lannan Foundation thought the exposure, because they really know there's a thin line between genius and crazy. I thank the members, if they're here, working with the New Mexico Poor People's Campaign. Some of them may be in the room. I want to thank this young man who introduced me. I want to thank God always for my dear sister, Phyllis Bennett, who's I can't see because of the lights, but is here. And I want to ask all of you, if you would, to go to Repairers of the Breach and then sign up for information so we can forward you more about the Poor People's Campaign. Now, I am quite observant, so I have to ask one thing. Is there a donkey over there in that left corner? Is there? Oh, I knew it was an animal. Hey, giraffe. How you doing? You really wanted to come out tonight, didn't you? Okay, all right. That's fusion politics. And by the way, it's not now 30, but 41 coordinating committees in 41 states and the District of Columbia. Miss Yara Allen, who's like the Mahalia of our movement, was coming tonight, but she fell a little ill with the high altitude. We've been on the road for 4 or 5 days, so I ask you to just keep her in your prayers as we're here tonight. I want to talk a little bit about the signs of the times. Reading the signs of the times. Since I'm a preacher, I've always begun my analysis of our social context with some insight from the scripture or some insight from Jesus. You don't have to be a Christian to learn something from Jesus, that brown-skinned Palestinian Jew. Who was crucified for being a rabble-rouser and for caring about the least of these. He had a reputation in his own day for making religious people mad. But Jesus told the public intellectuals in his day that they needed to learn something from sailors who knew how to read the signs of the time, who knew how to take warning from a red sky in the morning and how to delight in the red sky and the stars at night. Jesus said, you've got to be able to read the signs of the times. And I want to read some signs tonight. I want to read some signs tonight as we gather in this place. Phyllis and I were talking about this is the 16th year anniversary of the beginning of the Iraq War, wars that we should have never gone into. We just came out of this Kavanaugh experience. And some people think that that was just a 2-week ago experience, but actually, if you know the signs, it was in 2010 that the Chamber of Commerce decided really that they wanted to engage in a massive takeover of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court could begin to make rulings that favored corporate power. It was also beginning in 2010 that 26 states began to write massive voter suppression bills and pass them. States that represented 54% of all African Americans, states that represented over 270 electoral votes. A plan that was set in place to take over state houses so that state legislators, regressive extremist state legislators, could gerrymander districts and then determine congressional maps, and so that they could suppress the vote in order to guarantee Senate elections. In fact, you might ought to know that immediately following Trump's announcement of Kavanaugh's selection, the White House was touting Kavanaugh not as somebody who would overturn Roe, but he actually was touting Kavanaugh's record on battling over-regulation. They sent a document to industry stakeholders, and in that document, the White House wrote that Kavanaugh had overruled federal regulators 75 times on cases involving clean air, consumer protections, net neutrality, and other issues. All told, since Justice Samuel Alito joined Chief Justice John Roberts on the bench, the National Chamber of Commerce has won over 70% of its cases. It's not conservative. It's extremist justice sharing ideology that prizes limited government over regulation and the ability to vindicate individual rights. And anytime you have a constitution that says we the people, but you have justices ruling we the corporations, that is not conservatism, that is extremism. Anytime you have justices, that them being on the court translates into a thumb on the scale for corporate interest in case after case, that is not right. That is immoral. Consider this, that from Justice Alito, Gorsuch, Kennedy, Roberts, and Thomas cumulatively voted for the chamber's position 86% of the time. 86% of the time. And the justices that are on the bench even before Kavanaugh gave the chamber 3/4 of their total victories, 77.2%. And now Kavanaugh. And when you read the signs of the time and you combine this kind of over-concern for corporate interests with attacks on voting rights, attacks on women's rights, attacks on labor rights, it is dangerous. Because what you have is a court that treats corporations like people and people like things. And then when you add Kavanaugh to that mix, who, by his rulings before he got on the court, favored torture, favored deregulation of business, favored voter suppression. When a case came out of South Carolina that said their photo ID program was voter suppression, and the district court, Fourth Circuit, said it was for voter suppression, it was Kavanaugh that overturned that ruling. His rulings show that he has negative opinions toward immigrants and women's rights, and he believes in gun rights unhindered. And the reason I bring this up is because Kavanaugh was unfit before Dr. Ford. Now, sisters, I'm not dismissing, because I too I had sexual assault attempted against me twice, and there's no way in the world what women face. But I know something of that, and I want to get to that, but I want to show us why there was a raping of the system before we knew about Dr. Ford. There was an abuse of power, because before Ford, the system had been raped by voter suppression, papers being hidden, a seat being held open for 400 days in a way we had not seen since the Civil War, a 50+1 rule that was inserted when it used to be justices were only approved with 60 votes. And all of this happened before Ford, and then Ford and other women. And so what happened was abuse on top of abuse, rape on top of rape, because after Ford, there was refusal to have a serious investigation. There was a prosecutor and a kangaroo hearing. The prosecutor asked her question, but the senators gave him closing arguments. No court would act like that. They used the arguments that she was a confused woman and jammed it through. And you do know that inside of white nationalism and white supremacist thinking, that oftentimes sexual abuse and white supremacy and white nationalism have gone hand in hand. Flake ran a scam, and Collins voted him because she agrees with everything else. And the business interests said, look over that. And even Manchin, a Democrat, was more concerned about his office than a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court with someone who was unfit even before Ford, and even more unfit after. Signs of the time. Another sign is that now the GOP is taking a page from the segregationist playbook. When they saw people rising up, they called the nonviolent protesters a mob. That's a direct line from George Wallace. George Wallace in 1965, when a Southern judge ruled in favor of the Selma to Montgomery March, he called him a hypocrite. The judge, George Wallace, did. And here's what he said: who prostitutes our law in favor of that of mob rule. And this tactic is not unique to the American context. This is the language of Putin. This is the language of Netanyahu when he talks about the freedom fighters in Palestine and the young children that are standing up. This is the language of China when they challenge people who stand in Tiananmen Square and challenge domination. It is the language of the alliance of global extremists who, whenever people stand up, they denigrate them, demean them, and delegitimize protest by calling it mob rule and being outside of law and order. Another sign we must read in these times is religious nationalism. The religious nationalism of Graham and Paula White and Jeffers out of Texas and Falwell, this heresy of so-called white evangelicalism. There's not even such thing in the Bible as white evangelicalism. This strange religion that says that all God cares about is prayer in the school, being against abortion, being against gay people, tax cuts, law and order, private schools, guns, and America is first. And that's God's agenda? Really? But you might note that even though it sounds hilarious, the power of it and why it was started, know the signs. Kevin Cruz out of Princeton wrote a book, One Nation Under God, how the pulpits of America were purchased, and he traces it all the way back to 1935, the spiritual mobilization that was developed by a guy named James Fifield out of Los Angeles, California. The corporate leaders hated the New Deal. They hated minimum wage. They hated labor rights. They hated Social Security. And they wanted to come against it, but they didn't have moral standing because they had created so much negative with the 1929 stock market crash. So they did a poll. Who are the moral leaders of the country? And found out that the preachers and the pulpits had more power among the public, but they didn't control the pulpits. The pulpits were controlled more by the social gospelers. And so Fifield said, I can change that if you fund me. So the National Chamber of Commerce, Sun Oil, General Motors, and some others got together, put big money behind James Field. Look at Kevin's book, Kevin Cruz's book. He funded him, and inside of about 10 years, he had purchased about 20,000 pulpits and offered them some strange theology that says, if you're good, you'll be middle class and wealthy. If you're bad, you're poor, so therefore social programs should not be used to help the poor up because it allows them to violate God's process. And where did Fifield get it from? Slave master religion. The same religion that was used to counter the faith of the abolitionists who dared to challenge America's original sin of genocide and slavery, the signs of the times. Another sign of our time is this inadequate framing, left versus right. I'm so tired of progressives and other folk calling people, I'm on the left. Who told you that? You do know that language comes from the French Revolution. The left were those that didn't want the monarchy, the right were those who did want the monarchy. We spend time, they're on the right, but then we spend the next 30 minutes trying to convince people they're wrong. That's linguistic trauma. Dr. King and others never, they call people what they were, segregationists, extremists, immoral. What we do with this inadequate framing, it leaves us unable to call some things wrong and some things extremist, and we get caught giving equal moral standing to things that are not equal. But it's a sign of our time when we've almost in some ways lost the ability to talk in moral language. And then there's another sign, the daily distractions from the Twitter-in-chief. But Nancy McLean has a book you ought to read called Democracy in Chains, and she says every once in a while, maybe once a week out of a month, you ought to take a day off from the tweets and pay attention to the long game and recognize that Trump is just a tool being used in what extremists have been working for the past 50 years. and look at what is the truths underneath the tweets that we are not facing as a nation. Trump is a symptom of a deeper moral malady. Now, some of you may think this is a little gross, but I'm from the country. We tend to be like that. When you sneeze and you have a cold, something comes out of your nose. I won't call the name of it. But you don't treat that. That's the symptom of something else going on inside your body. Trump is the symptom. That's why he's so messy. As Neil Painter, the Princeton historian, says, Trump is an iconography of a too often played script in the American project. We go forward a little ways, and then there's this violent, vicious, regressive pushback. She even said one time, no Obama, no Trump. Trump, and his cohorts in Congress and state capitals, and an extreme oligarchy represent a fear, race, and class-driven ideology. All the money and power for a certain few is what they want. And they know that if we're unified and clear on what's at stake, they can have it. Therefore, the distractions. So they engage in the distractions and wedge issues to keep us from seeing what they're doing and from seeing one another. But what's really going on under the tweets? That's why you need to take a look at the Souls of Poor Folk, auditing America 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign. Right now, there are 4 diseases, and they're all connected, 4 evils, if you will, that threaten the nation's social and moral health. Systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, and the war economy that are too often undergirded by this strange Christian nationalism, religious nationalism that will literally go in and pray, P-R-A-Y, for a president and a Congress while they are praying, P-R-E-Y-A-N-G, on those whom Jesus and people of religious faith care about the most, the poor and the least of these. But understand, Trump is the symptom. The disease didn't start with him, nor did the tactics. Systemic racism. I'm not talking about Roseanne Barr calling somebody an ugly word. That's not racism that I'm concerned about. Or not even Charlottesville, even though that is racism, but you have to understand every politician that has any sense will denounce what happened in Charlottesville. They say, oh, that's bad. But there is a racism that is not about hate, it's about power. It's not just against black people, it is against the American project itself. Because those same politicians that will denounce Charlottesville will go back to Congress and pass bills that have a disparate impact on black, brown, and poor white people. So before Trump, 6 years before Trump, we had systemic voter suppression. And then in 2013, 3 years before Trump, that Supreme Court ruled 5-4 to gut the Voting Rights Act. So since 2013, June 25th, we've had less voting rights than we had in August 6th, 1965. They gutted the provision that said southern states and California, some places, and New York, and other places like Alaska, and had to be pre-cleared before they could pass certain gerrymandering, before they could pass certain bills. Once that was off the table, it allowed the state legislatures to pass those bills, implement those bills, and yes, advocates could challenge those bills, but while those bills and those policies of voter suppression were being enforced, we were in court. The court could then rule that the bills were unconstitutional, but all the things they did for the 2 or 3 or 4 years would still be in place. This is the systemic racism. So systemic racism is the hostility toward immigrants. Systemic racism is locking and snatching children in a way, not children, brown children, in a way you know would not happen. Systemic racism is the resegregation of our public schools. systemic racism. And then we have the attacks on the LGBT community and the cuts to education funding. So that's one of the diseases, systemic racism. Systemic racism. And it's amazing how in the systemic racism, and when it's policy driven, they might never call you the N-word. In fact, you know, there's a strange thing if you read the signs of the times now about systemic racism. They even have, it's possible now to be black and be a white nationalist. It is. Or at least an enabler. Because if you're in the Congress or you're in the Senate and you're black, but you're against voter rights, and you're against fair immigration, you may not be white, but you are voting a white nationalist policy agenda. My grandmama used to say, if you walk like a duck and you quack like a duck, you must be a duck. And those of us that know history know that that is not new. How many of you all heard of the movie Django Unchained? There have always been forces, people who got so caught up and so internalized racism that they ended up joining racism rather than fighting against it. And then we have this issue of systemic poverty. We constantly hear that there are 39 million poor people in America. That's not true. There are 140 million poor and low wealth people in America. In the richest society in human history, while people are chasing the tweets right now in America, following the distraction, even the news media not reporting it, half of the American population, almost 43.5%, lives in poverty. 39 million children, 21 million elders, 26 million black people, 38 million Latinx, 8 million Asians, and 66 million white people are poor. And the majority of the poor live in the same states that pass racist voter suppression law. Now, isn't that something? We do a map sometime in our teaching, and we put up all the states that did voter suppression, and then we overlay that with the states that have the highest poverty, the greatest attack on immigrants, the greatest attack on the LGBT community, the lowest union density, the lowest wages, and the highest need for health care. And it's all the same states. So that if you only knew that a state was engaging in racist voter suppression, you could almost surmise that that state was also a high poverty and a low wage state. And here is the irony. The very people that get elected by racist voter suppression laws, when they get in office, they pass bills that hurt mostly poor white women and their children. And yet they try to divide us. 62 million people in this country work every day and make less than a living wage. There's not a county in this country where working at a minimum wage you can afford a basic two-room apartment. The top 400 taxpayers earn an average of $97,000 an hour, while we are arresting people because they want 15 and a union, and they can't survive on 720. The signs underneath the distraction. 49% of the people right here in New Mexico are poor or low income. 1 million residents right here. 58% of them are children. 58% of children. 58% of people of color. 35% of white people. From 1979 to 2012, the income gap for the 1% grew by 82%, while the income for the bottom 99 decreased by 9%. Poverty. Poverty. There are 37 million people without health care, even with the Affordable Care Act. And almost every state, as I said, that did voter suppression denied expanding health care. For every 1 million people that do not get health care, something like 5,600 people die. So there are people dying because of political murder. It has nothing to do with God calling them home. Think about it. Every senator gets free health care. Every congressperson gets free health care. Every legislator gets free subsidies for health care. Every governor gets free health care. And yet we have people so ruthless that they wake up every morning to deny their constituents the very thing they get. When it comes to ecological devastation, we talk about Flint, Michigan. But there are 4 million families in this country that get up every day and can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water. Oil companies are drilling for natural gas on Apache lands and Pueblo lands, and we've never really owned that fact in America. Right? We're on stolen land even here tonight. Coal ash is spilling into rivers. Pipelines are being built through sacred lands. Alaska and the wilderness there, they're talking about deregulating. I've been there with the Alaskan people and the natives there, and they are hurting, they are crying. And then when it comes to war, this war economy, we spend 53 cents, it soon will be 60 cents of every discretionary dollar on the war economy. Less than 15 cents on education and health care. That's the sign of this time that we're in. The average CEO makes $19 million a year. The average combat soldier makes less than 30 and sometimes has to get on food stamps when they come back from combat. Thousands of veterans would have gotten health care if health care had been expanded everywhere. 45,000 veterans have incomes below $35,000 in New Mexico. 26% of New Mexico's veterans population has incomes under $45,000. Under $45,000. We have bases everywhere. We've not invaded, every country we've invaded since World War II for the most part have been black and brown countries. People are making a killing off of killing. And poverty has become the new draft. And we've paid more than $4 trillion since 2001 to fight the so-called war on terror, while claiming we lack the resources to ensure health care and pay people a living wage. And we must face the fact, my brothers and sisters, that these interlocking injustices in American society have been undermining our democracy for some time. And it is clear that the extremists want the Congress, the legislature, and the presidency so they can foster this society for the few, by the few, in the name of the few. And the last sign we have to look at is the fact that too often our political processes don't get it. We had 26 presidential debates during the primary and the general election in 2016, and not one debate on poverty. When 43.5% of your population is in poverty and you don't have one debate, not one presidential candidate was asked, not one senator. Too often Democrats talk about the middle class only, and Republicans talk about if you help give a child free lunch, it'll mess them up morally. We had 26 presidential debates and not one on the war economy. Not 1 hour on ecological devastation. Not 1 hour on systemic racism and voter suppression. And because we lack a robust moral narrative, we are easily tossed to and fro by the distractions of our Twitter-in-chief now. With the most recent revelations of grave concerns within the White House, we hear over and over again concerns about his mental health and appeals to the 25th Amendment. Now, I leave mental health diagnoses to healthcare professionals, but I think we would do well to go a little deeper if we're really reading the signs of the time, when Dr. King said, sometimes we need to talk about the spiritual sickness of the nation. The fact of the matter is, you may call him insane and think that if Trump was removed tomorrow, all of our problems would be fixed. But Trump has an entire cohort of extremism. And what we're seeing is too often a recurring American condition, because 60 million people, like it or not, voted for him. We're not just seeing the problem of a person or a personal mental state. We're seeing the problem of a nation. We saw this problem around 1870, when after the nation had begun to reconstruct itself after slavery and the Civil War, a group rose up called the Redemption Movement. They hated black-white alliances. They did not want a democracy that represented everybody. So they began to push back against that progress, not only in the South, but in federal policies as well. How did they push back in 1870, 71, and on? They attacked voting. They took over the courts. They attacked access to public education. They increased incarceration. They cut taxes to keep the federal government from providing health care and resources to former slaves and poor blacks. They used violent attacks and words against progressive blacks and whites. They split any labor unions efforts between black and white, and in 1877, they selected a president that lost the popular vote. And then that president began to put Supreme Court justices on the court that would be the very Supreme Court justices that in 1883 would overturn the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and their final act would be the Supreme Court of the United States when it made separate but equal the law of the land in 1896. This, my friends, is not new. It is a recurring situation, a recurring disease in the American process. But, my friends, there are other signs. And while an honest assessment of our moral malady may tempt some to despair, we look at the fact that we have 250,000 people dying every day from poverty, dying every year from poverty, more than die from heart attacks, strokes, and cancer. When we see this mean-spiritedness, it might make us want to just fold our hands. But there are other signs. Remember, Jesus said the signs of the times. I read one sign the other day when an author that talked about voting, and she said, we should vote. And voting is now, some tell people, the only reliable path to good, accountable government. She said, and voting is relatively easy. But then she went on to say, but we must understand that we can't just say vote. We got to say vote and something else. She says, if voting is our only recourse, it ignores the reality of how progress has been achieved over the course of U.S. history. The powers and freedoms that have been won by our most marginalized sisters and brothers did not come from voting alone. They voted and something else. When you look at the turning points of American century-long evolution from a fiefdom of white male aristocracy to the present, when the white male aristocracy is fighting viciously for ongoing dominance, you are quickly reminded that the powers and freedoms that have been won by our most marginalized sisters and brothers did not come from voting alone. The right to vote, to unionize, to gain equal access and treatment came to pass largely because people grew loud enough to disrupt everyday life, which frightened the powerful and compromised their vote. They did not just vote, they voted and organized. How did we change America? Turn this up some. How did we change America? They waged sustained and organized activism that often pushed, she said, the limits of the laws that are now viewed as unjust. When Americans of color sat at white-only lunch counters and refused to move, some of them could not vote, but they didn't remain silent. They were too young to vote, but they didn't remain silent, and they helped organize and build a movement. In 1917, when women weren't allowed to vote, they still organized the suffragists. They picketed the White House. They did not simply vote, they voted and built a movement. And if they couldn't vote, they built a movement. America is going through a third reconstruction. And another writer I was reading just the other day said, we can't just be angry. He said, fury, the energy of fury is the boost is temporary. It's like sugar. It wears off, leaving us more depleted than before it surged through us. Rage alone will not provide the sustenance we need to undo some of the damage so rapidly being done and make the bold political and economic changes necessary for our very survival, this writer says. No, we need a long-term struggle full of hope. Now, he says, by hope, I don't mean unwarranted or even justified confidence that we will achieve the outcomes we desire, but the hope that locates itself in the premise that we don't know what will happen, and that in in the spaciousness of uncertainty, there is room to act. Hope is the embrace of the unknown and the unknowable, an alternative to the certainty of both optimists and pessimists. Optimists think it will be fine without our involvement. Pacifists adopt the opposite position. Both excuse themselves from acting. But those who are full of hope, they act. They act. And they act in such a way that they know even if what they do today doesn't change things tomorrow, it will sow the seeds that will change things in the days to come. There are other signs. And so there are other signs. Young people, March for Our Lives, coming together, making gun control a moral issue and connecting it to racism and poverty. I see signs. Women, black and white and brown and native and Latino and Asian, forming an intersectional coalition to put back against extremism of narcissistic white men. I see signs. The Poor People's Campaign. Over the past 3 years, something has happened when rejected people have come together, because America needs moral leadership now who will step forward and stand in the gap. And the good news is we have them. I've traveled this country. We've heard from mothers whose children died in their arms because their states refused to expand Medicaid. And we said, what do you want to do? They said, it's time for a movement. We've met with homeless families whose encampments have been attacked by police and militia groups, and they've joined the movement. We visited the border wall and met with families ripped apart by unjust immigration policies, and they are now joining the movement. We had a mass meeting in Compton that drew hundreds of people from all walks of life. It was simultaneously translated into Spanish, Korean, and Armenian. And at the end of a meeting, a lifelong welfare rights and anti-poverty organizer, Miss Martha, approached us with tears in her ears. She said, I've been waiting for this movement for 50 years. I've been waiting for us to talk about poverty openly and racism openly and ecological devastation openly and the war economy openly. I got one more fight in me. I'm joining the movement. Night before last, I was in Kansas. Night before last, I was in Kansas. And over in Kansas, we had white workers and black workers and native, and we had cattlemen and cattlewomen. Over 1,000 people gathered in Kansas in the middle of a downpour and a tornado watch. They came out in Kansas. Last night I was in Missouri. The church was overflow. Couldn't get any more people in. People standing out in the rain. The Latino and Lakota and Sioux and white and another cattleman, black preacher, rabbi, imam, Unitarian, and people that don't even believe in religion, but they say amen to justice and love and all that good stuff. I'm telling you. You see, my friends, there's another sign. This is not the worst we have seen. Anybody that tells you this is the worst thing they've ever seen, tell them to read history. This isn't worse than slavery. This isn't worse than the Holocaust. This isn't worse than what women face, and they made it through that. So we might be tempted by despair when we think about the Supreme Court for the next 30 years and Mitch McConnell and extremists who've invested all this money in subverting democracy. I thought, though, I might remind us this evening of another dark day in history of the Supreme Court and the Dred Scott decision, 1857, 161 years ago, 161 years ago. The Dred Scott decision, a black man has no rights that a white man has to honor. The Dred Scott decision was pushed by Taney, a Supreme Court justice that had been rushed through the nominating process, had been pushed through, And he said he was going to shut down this abolitionist stuff once and for all. March 1857, 161 years ago. But then in May of 1957, 3 months later, here's what Frederick Douglass said. It is an open rebellion against God's government, what this Supreme Court has done. It is an attempt to undo what God has done, to blot out the broad distinctions instituted by the all-wise between men and things, and to change the image and the subscription of the ever-living God into a speechless piece of merchandise. Such a decision cannot stand. God will be true, though every man be a liar. We can appeal from this hell-black judgment of the Supreme Court to the court of common sense and common humanity. We can appeal from man to God. If there is no justice on earth, there's yet justice in heaven. You may close your Supreme Court against the black man's cry for justice, but you cannot, thank God, close it against him, the ear of a sympathizing world, nor shut up the court of heaven. All that is merciful and just on earth and in heaven will despise this edict of Tanit. And if it were at all likely that the people of these free states would tamely submit to this demonical judgment, I might feel gloomy. I might feel sad over it. And possibly it might be necessary for my people to look for a home in some other country. But as the case stands, we have nothing to fear. In one point of view, one sign, the abolitionists and the colored people should meet this decision unlooked for the monstrous as monstrous as it appears, but we should look at it in a cheerful spirit. This very attempt to blot out forever the hopes of an enslaved people may be one necessary link in the chain of events preparatory to the downfall and complete overthrow of the whole slave system. The whole history of the anti-slavery movement is studied with proof that all measures devised and executed with a view to ally and diminish the anti-slavery agitation have only served to increase, intensify, and embolden that agitation. So I stopped by this evening to say that with Kavanaugh on the court and all this crazy stuff in the Congress and in the White House and the state houses, it might look grim, but could it be that this is one necessary overreach in the chain of events preparatory to the downfall and complete overthrow of extremism that has hobbled our democracy? Oh, my friends. Oh, my friends. I came all the way to Santa Fe to tell you that today's overreach should embolden and intensify and increase our agitation. If the signs unveil the extremism, not only of Trump, but of McConnell and Ryan and the political establishment that has been willing to compromise them, there are other signs. There's another point of view. And this moment is not about saving a party. It's about a moral agenda. It's about saving the soul of America. It is about challenging the evils of systemic racism and poverty and ecological devastation and the war economy. And if anything, what is going on today should embolden, intensify, and increase our agitation. Because in every generation, we've needed moral articulation to speak out against our nation's flaws, either from our deepest faith tradition or our deepest constitutional tradition. Silence is not an option. Our times demand moral activism. We are required sometimes not just to dissent, but to disrupt nonviolently what is disruptive, not with hate, but with revolutionary love and a mind state on justice. We must love this nation enough to take a knee and to call this nation to the knee of repentance. Oh, I'm telling you, in this moment, we must embolden, intensify, and increase our agitation. We must love this nation enough to stand between an ICE agent who's been ordered to do wrong and the immigrant neighbor who just wants to do right. We must embolden, increase, and intensify our agitation. We must love this democracy enough to go to jail for it, in nonviolent civil disobedience, to sue in the courts for it, and to register everybody we know to vote and get them to the ballot box. No, our efforts must be emboldened, intensified, and increased. We must embolden and intensify and increase our agitation. We must love one another and love this nation enough to demand change, to declare that some issues are not left versus right and Republican versus Democrat, but some issues are about right versus wrong. It's right to make sure every human being has health care. It's right to make sure every human being has access to a living wage. It's right to make sure every child has access to a strong and a constitutional and a diverse and a well-funded public education. And our efforts must be emboldened, must be increased, and must intensify. we in this nation, we must love it so much that when our nation and our Congress will make a decision to invest $1.5 trillion in corporations and wealthy elites rather than anti-poverty programs, this must embolden our efforts, intensify and increase our agitation. When we see people, no matter what climate change is showing us, still want to do fossil fuels, still want to hurt the environment, our efforts must be emboldened, intensify and increase. When we see people needing affordable housing and needing labor rights, this is no time for us to sit down. When we see warmongering and this business of using war for money over and over again, this is no time. Frederick Douglass said we must embolden, intensify, and increase our agitation because these are moral issues. These are moral issues. And we must remember that Trump didn't win. And long before we knew about Russia, because I don't know what Russia did, but I know what voter suppression did. I know that there were 968 fewer polling places in black and brown poor communities. I know that the Brennan Center says if it was not for racialized gerrymandering, about 20 of the seats in the United States House of Representatives wouldn't be there. I know that Trump so-called won Wisconsin by 30,000 votes, but there were 250,000 votes suppressed in Wisconsin. I know that 97 million people who were registered to vote didn't even vote because they didn't hear their conditions, poverty and racism. And I know that they're out now. I know that right now, if we began right now, we go to November, then after November, if we register 30% of the unregistered black voters in the South and connect them with a moral agenda and then hook them up with progressive whites in the South and Latinos in the South in states like North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama, and Texas, there will no longer be a solid South. We can break through the solid South. And if we change the South, we change the nation. We change the political calculus of this country. And that's why I've decided to work with Repairers of Breach and the Poor People's Campaign, because yes, I see the sign of how ugly it is, but I also see another sign. I need to see the sign of history that says every time people have pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed people down, pride cometh before the fall. And that now is the time that we must intensify, embolden, and increase our agitation. It is not time to stop. It is time for us to push until we ensure domestic tranquility, until we establish justice, until we provide for the common defense, until we promote the general welfare. It is time for us to push until we are one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. What has been done ought not shut us down. It ought to make us stand up. It's time to rise up. It's time to come together. We, in fact, must be the sign that extremism will not have the last word. And we've seen it before during the Reconstruction. We saw it in the Civil Rights Movement. And James Baldwin told us, we made the world we're living in. And so we have to make it over again. I want you to know that we have the power to do this. One election can't turn us back. One loudmouth can't turn us back. George Wallace couldn't turn us back. Bull Connor didn't turn us back. Slavery didn't turn us back. We might get bruised and battered, but it's time to intensify, increase, and embolden our organizing. It's time to organize a strong section of those 140 million impacted people, impacted by systemic racism and poverty and ecological devastation, a war economy, because it may be very well that the rejected people in that 140 million are the key to saving the heart and the soul of this nation. And so it's time to embolden and intensify and increase our agitation. Let me close with this. My assistant, Charmaine Fletcher, had a cousin, a nephew, and not long ago, her nephew suddenly fell out. Heart stopped. And his wife was a nurse, and she worked on him. And in a few minutes, the paramedics came there, and they worked on him. And then finally they said, he's gone. And they called him dead. But his wife was an intensive care nurse. And she said, I've seen some things happen. I know the signs look like he's dead, but I want you to try one more time. They said, there's no need. She said, if you don't do it, I'll do it myself. And so they started trying again. And in about 5 minutes, they got a beat. I met him a few weeks ago. He's up living. He's walking around today because his wife refused to only see the sign of death. She also saw right in the midst of death possibility, and she emboldened, increased, and intensified her efforts. One of my Sikh friends said, Reverend Barber, there's something called a grave and something called a womb. Both are dark. If you're in the grave, there's no pushing out. But in the womb, if you push hard enough, you come forth to the light. What if this moment we're in is not a grave, but a womb? What if there's possibility all around us? What if this moment is making us come together like we've never come together before? And so if I was home in my little country church, I would say it like this: weeping may endure for a night, but joy still comes in the morning. We shall overcome. We shall survive. Justice will win. Truth will live. The lion will lay down with the lamb. Crooked places will be straightened out. Rough places will be made smooth. The glory of the Lord will be seen. Modern day racists and narcissists must not know who we are. We are not a mob. We are the movement. The Tea Party must not know who we are. The Freedom Caucus must not know who we are. We are the sons and daughters of love and justice. We are the sons and daughters of Martin and Rabbi Heschel and Rosa Parks and Dorothy Day and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. We are the sons and daughters of Abraham and Sarah and Muhammad and Moses and Jesus and Mary. We were born for right now. And if you thought hurting us was going to stop us, no, it will embolden us. It will increase us. It will intensify us. For we will not give up on this democracy. Not now. Not ever. Not now. Not ever. Not now. Not ever. Whew. Let me have one of those. Thank you, man.
Is this thing on? Mic check. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Great. I told you it'd be worth it. Thank you, Reverend Barber.
Thank you. Thank them.
You know, a few years back, another dark time, maybe not quite as dark as this one, but I remember it was a dark time and a friend of mine said, but you need to see what's happening in North Carolina. And I looked into it, and that friend was talking about Moral Mondays. And more recently, you have been part of the revival of the Poor People's Campaign. And I was very excited to hear about it and also curious. This thing that you played such a central role in building up in North Carolina, how could this translate across the country? And so that was the question one of the questions that I came to Santa Fe with, and then I heard you talk about Kansas. This thing that happened the other night, and it's been on my mind because folks may know that Mr. Trump had a rally in Kansas of a very different sort. Right. And so I wonder if you could talk more about your meeting in Kansas, because that, what produced that? What did that look like?
Well, the continuing. Kansas was one of the states that joined in the 41 states that are part of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. You kind of have to say it all. And part of the history is, we say it was Dr. King's, but that too disables our ability to really continue. First of all, the Poor People's Campaign of '68 wasn't stopped, it was assassinated. They were killing presidents and presidential candidates and civil rights leaders. Dr. King was shot, neck was severed in Memphis with a deer rifle. before he got to Washington, D.C. But Dr. King called together the group that people said he shouldn't. Even some black people said that he shouldn't. He called 25 people together, Jews, welfare rights workers, Jewish Federation, Catholics, people impacted by poverty. And he said, we have to stop separating civil rights, racism from the war, militarism, and bring them together. Now, that wasn't his first time. He had done that a lot of times before. So in the Moral Monday movement, we came to find out that in 2013, when the extremist legislature took over under the name of calling themselves Republican, but they weren't, because my grandfather was a Republican, a Lincoln Republican, and he didn't act like these people. This is not Republicanism. And because I would have to say, some of the things we fought for years for, we had to fight Democrats for. It took us 25 years to get same-day registration and early voting from Democrats. So I just always have to say that, because sometimes we have to work too hard with our friends and fight too much with our enemies. That's why I'm a registered independent. You know, I choose how I want to vote. But anyway, from January to May, actually in the first 50 days, they attacked everybody. They had a supermajority and the governor. They denied health care, they denied living wages, they denied unemployment insurance extension. They went after the LGBTQ community, they went after Latino, they went after the women. And then during Easter week, they filed a voter suppression bill. It was Senate Bill 666.
Wow. It's a happy Easter from...
Now, the computer put that number on it. They didn't do it. The computer. And then they tabled it. And then after Easter, they took out one part of it and filed, it's called House Bill 589, and it was just the extreme photo ID, right, portion. Even though North Carolina had the best protection laws called signature attestation, you know, nobody had ever violated it. For the most part, you sign your name, you get a 5-year felony if you lie. And we said, if they're gonna crucify the sick, the poor, the women, the gay people, and then crucify voting rights, every crucifixion needs a witness. And so in April, the last Monday in April, we decided to go into legislature. Now they told us, you cannot come in the legislature, you cannot protest in the area between the two doors, you cannot quote scripture, you cannot bring a placard. Like, no, you can't tell us who came up with these rules. We did. Well, we said that's not in the Constitution. The Constitution actually said that the Constitution in North Carolina actually demands that people come. So 17 of us went in, 7 preachers and other people, and one lady who's a paraplegic. They let us talk for about an hour, and then they arrested even that woman in that wheelchair. And the next week people came. The next week, till about the end of the summer, it was 900 and some odd people had come. Now, here's the story. Moral Monday, even though each Monday had a theme, we did that to connect the issues, right? Because they wanted people to be separated. So we went all over the state showing people, because we would go in a community to say that was predominantly white, and they would say, well, we don't really need that Medicaid expansion because that's Obamacare. We said, you realize that's a racial name, that they did that for a reason. Did you know 1,000 people in your county are without health care? And it can't be any black people because there are no black people up here. And they would say, no, I didn't know that. Did you know that the same guy you voted for that said he would be against gay people and be against and be for prayer in the school and that would stop people from cheating in the vote also voted to cut the money for public education, and you're losing 36 jobs in your we didn't know that. So, And so then we put that, now on the other side we had to say to black people, because there were some black folks that said, you president of NAACP, you're supposed to look out for black people. I said the NAACP didn't even start out as black. It was mostly white when it was founded. And it's supposed to focus on justice. And what we say is, when people say, is it race or class, we say it is. I mean, and so by doing that way, and then by framing it not as Democrat, not as Republican, but as moral, and not moral just from a religious standpoint. Some people religious, some people constitutional, but people were able to come in, they were able to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience together. So some days, one story is when we had 2 ladies, one was 90 years old, the other was 90 years old, they were 92. 2 old white ladies who joined hands, they were on walkers, and I said, y'all don't have to go, and they said, shut up, we know what we're doing. And I said, well, okay then. And then they said, when we were little girls, they wouldn't let us do this. But we know what's up. We know the game. And so they went in and got arrested together. And they led 157 other people in that day. And so what happened real quickly is by the 6th week, the governor's number had dropped from over 50% to under 40. He never recovered. When we started, the major newspapers were laughing at us. By the end of 6 weeks, they were all writing editorials that we were right. We had reframed the narrative. And it continued for 4 years. And then we registered thousands of new voters. Then we built a legal team to fight against what they had done. And what people often don't say about Maura Monday, we won. We won in the South. We turned back North Carolina's racist voter suppression law. And it was so much of a victory that the Supreme Court had to agree with the Fourth Circuit that it was surgical racism. Now, when the racists have to agree with when the racists have to vote against the racists, that's pretty good when you make a case. You know. But not only that, by registering new voters, the governor, who was the leader of that crowd, got a little vacation to go think about his morality. Right? And we won gerrymandering, so this coming election, we have the first opportunity to recapture the state legislature. And that didn't happen overnight. Now, why could it spread? Because if we don't deal with these state capitals, we aren't serious about changing American politics. Because the vote is suppressed in state capitals. Denying living wages happens in state capitals. Bad incarceration laws standing in state capitals. Public education money to state capitals. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And too often what we've done is focus just on the president or just on the Senate or Congress, when in fact the state capitals. Now, how have extremists won in state capitals? They have separated people by this right, left, or they've separated people by race. And what the moral movement says is we have to have this intersectional movement to deal with these interlocking injustices. And what we found when we brought that into the Poor People's Campaign, that people are ready for it, man. And we teach it empirically and emotionally. You know, we teach it emotionally by, when we have our session, we pull your finger and we try to pull it off and see if you want your mouth open. And we say, see, it's all connected. But then we also show that if there are 140 million poor people, and the majority of them in America are white, but the largest percentage of them are black. And if there are large numbers of poor people in every race and every ethnicity, and if the same people that are keeping, guaranteeing incomes and health care and living wages from the poor people, if they're fighting together, why are we all separated? We went up to Eastern Kentucky and talked about it. Why are we separated? The other night I found out in Kansas, that real quickly, in Missouri, we had Missouri, that there were some farmers, a nurse told us of farmers, that throw themselves into their columbine and kill themselves, but it ought to be called accidental death, just so that their families can get insurance because they're so broke. Now, I don't care if that person's a cattleman from Missouri or a black woman from Mississippi. The bottom line is the same people that are denying health care in Missouri, are the same mindset in Missouri are doing in Mississippi. So if they are cynical enough to be together, why aren't we smart enough to come together?
Right.
And why would we allow people to continue to separate us? So we actually put the numbers up empirically, and then I say things to people, and we go in and talk. I said, look, you can let these people fool you and say that black people are getting all this free stuff and that's why you're poor. Let me tell you something. The bottom line is, if you're black and you're poor, and you're white and you're poor, and you're Latino and you're poor, and you're Asian and you're poor, and you're Native and you're poor, and you can't pay your light bill, we all black in the dark. So if we're gonna be black in the dark, we ought to be together in the light. You see what I'm saying?
Sounds good.
A baby, when that baby cries because their parents can't feed them, that baby doesn't cry white, doesn't cry black, it doesn't cry Latino, it cries pain. Now, lastly, that doesn't mean, though, you don't deal with the race issue.
Right.
Because you cannot deal with this American project without dealing with both race and class, right? And intersection. The thing we're trying to show folk is that voting rights is as much an issue for poor white people and working and low wealth white people as it is for black people, because the very people that get elected through racial voter suppression and lie about people cheating to get you to agree with them on passing bills to suppress the vote are the same people that keep living wages out your pocket. And that's the piece that we have to to engage, and that's how we do it. And by adding the moral critique, some progressives got so mad at Jerry Falwell and all them, they just threw religion and morality, out the door. And then some churches got to the place where the real issue isn't church versus the state, it's church versus the state of the people. There's no connection between what happens in church and synagogues and places and what's actually happening to the people. But every major religion, if you read them, says that the primary moral issues ought to be, how is that religion speaking to the nation as it relates to the issues of poverty, hunger, sickness, being despised because you're an outsider? As Howard Thurman says, the ultimate question of life is, where do you stand in relationship to the rejected and the despised, and the disinherited?
Wow. I got another question for you. Speaking about intersectionality and what people are ready for. You gave an incredible speech tonight. I know that a week or two ago, you gave another incredible speech in St. Paul at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights conference as a keynote. And in doing that, you are in good company with other Black public intellectuals like Angela Davis, Cornel West, Alice Walker, who have also championed the question of Palestine and Palestinian rights. And I wonder if you could say why you gave that speech and what, this is talked about, when it's talked about at all in this country, it's talked about as this distant thing. Why is this relevant for people like us here?
Well, I would say that in that speech, and I talked a lot to my good friend Phyllis Bennis, I talked some to Cornell, I talked to a number of people, even rabbis that I know, and imams. Because when I was invited, I was humbled by the invitation. But I decided to do something a little different than just go in and give a political speech about Palestine. I wanted to talk about humanity and raise the first question of both the Judeo-Christian teaching, and that is, what does it mean to believe that everybody, whether they're Jewish, Palestinian, Hindu, whatever, they're all made in the image of God? What is our responsibility? Because governments, states don't have rights, people do. They have human rights. And then I wanted to look at it through the lens of my own history, my own DNA, and the challenges of my history. The first Civil Rights Act that I was a part of, or Human Rights Act, was when I was born. And my father would not allow the hospital to put on my birth certificate simply Negro. He said, that's not who he is. His grandmother was, and others were, full-blooded Tuscarora natives, people, First Nation, who had their land stolen, who were wiped away. His other people are white people who worked with black people, mulattoes, free issue black people, during slavery, built alliances. And so I have cousins that are as blue-eyed and blonde-haired as any white person in this room. The trauma, the genocide of the First Nation people, and the terrible genocide and and chattel slavery of black people, I felt like gave me a particular lens to talk about policies that traumatize anybody's humanity. And to say to Jewish people, even those that I would hope you would join with this, and if it was happening to Jewish people, we would say the same thing. Right. Because of the imago Dei. I wanted to look back at how some of the early development of extreme Zionism had nothing to do with the Holocaust. It was way before then. And also that there were Jewish forces who disagreed. I wanted to talk some to Palestinian people about the way of nonviolence and not coming from people who had not had to use it, but from people who had to stand up against power and face death but yet chose, you know, even, there's a preacher from the 1850s that says, even in slavery, you must choose who's going to be your God, the way of the slave master, the way of God. You have to choose how you're going to respond even to the evil so that you don't become the evil. And so I wanted to be very clear. And then I wanted to say from that human perspective, not a political speech, it was a moral speech, it was from my faith. Then America, if you know a new law is being passed that is nothing more but modern day apartheid law in Israel, it's just like, you have to call apartheid is apartheid, apartheid. I don't care what people it's against, it's apartheid. Call it what it is. And if your money, if your military machinery is in any way being used by extremists to destroy and maim and kill people, human beings who are made in the image of God, then that has to be challenged, right? So that's the perspective I wanted to come. I wanted really, my degree is in pastoral care and public policy. I wanted to give a pastoral, very pastoral and prophetic speech, not based in anybody's ideology per se, not based in one group or another, but strictly from this perspective. If I and the faith I declare believes that everybody is created in the image of God, the imago Dei, then any policy or effort or action that I engage in that destroys, demeans, and degrades them is a violation against God and the person. And maybe if we started there in wrestling with, because what has happened is the policies have suggested that the Palestinians, just like the policies of America suggested that the Pueblo people and the First Nation people and my people and the policies of America once suggested that black people are a subspecies. And that, my friends, is something worse than a political decision. When you choose to act in a way that sees other people as subhuman or less than or second-class humanity, you have opened a gate which leads to evils that are unimaginable. And whether you're Jewish, Palestinian, or other, you should want to stand against that.
I mean, that framework, and particularly what you ended on, the kind of violence that's possible when you dehumanize people. When you say that, I can't help but think about the caging of children and separation of families at the border. Yeah. And I wonder if you could talk more about, just in the few minutes we have left, the kind of dehumanization that's taking place in this time, but also this fight that you're waging to locate humanity and to assert it.
Now, I will say some things tonight that will sound strange to your audience because we often get locked into the issue of the day by the media, which is part of the problem of the moral narrative in this country. Even the so-called liberal media, because they get fixated on one issue and we don't do the linkages. So here's the thing we have to do. The violence against the children being snatched at the border did not start with them. The gate was opened earlier. Okay. Coretta Scott King said one time when she was asked what did she think about violence in the light of the fact that her husband had been shot violently, and she stopped for a minute, looked and said, well, you know, that is violence, but that's not the only violence. She said, denying people housing is violence. Denying health care is violence. Denying people's culture is violence. Keeping people from education is violence. Denying living wages is violence. Blocking people's right to organize as unions is violence. Hurting people because of their sexuality is violence. Destroying people because of their immigrant status is violence. And then she said, and then there's another form of violence, an apathetic attitude that refuses to address the other violence. So how do you get this kids being snatched and there's hardly and the whole country is not basically shut down? How do you get to the place where it can be done to brown children, and you know that would not have happened if all those kids were white and being locked up, or well-off people? They could be white or black, but if they were wealthy, how do you get there? Well, the violence of denying health care. Let's see how far we can go. People died and bled for the voting rights. Let's see if we can undo that. That's a form of political violence. Let's see if we can talk about cutting food stamps. That's a form of violence. Let's see if we can make people say you need to work in order to get things, but then we don't create jobs so they can work. That's a form of violence. Denying living wages is violence. Sending people to war for profit, violence. Let's see how much we see. You've opened the gate.
Right.
And if there is apathy, political apathy. You heard me say we had 26 presidential debates. Even in the primary, 140 million people living in poverty, 43.5% of your population. And even in the primary, even in the Democrat-Republican primary, not 1 hour on poverty. Not one full debate committed to poverty. Not one full debate committed to voting rights. That's a form of political apathy or political distancing. Most politicians don't even say the word poor. They act like it's a disease. They got this strange neoliberalism that if you just focus on the middle class, everything will be all fine. And for God's sake, we don't talk about race until somebody says something stupid like the N-word. We don't talk about the racial impact of politics. All of those become forms of violence where the gate has been opened. So once you open the gate and people don't push back hard, well, let's try doing this to these children.
So we got to push back hard.
See the gate, you come down the stairwell, come down the escalator, and stand up and say all Mexican are racist and da 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 da.
Right.
And the media play with that, you've opened the gate. And if politicians don't stand up, not as left, right, Democrat, Republican, but challenge it and be willing to go to the mat, morally, you open the gate. And once that gate is open, things can happen that are unimaginable, right? Our work now is to say, well, it has happened before. But in every age, people have said, it's enough. And they've chosen to be on the side of nonviolence, truth, and love, and rather than on the side of violence. So the Poor People's Campaign, Repairs the Breach, the work we're trying to do is to say, we will not live apathetically watching all of this policy violence going on and not mobilize together and find every person we can of every race, creed, color, and sexual orientation until we find the remnant. One writer says all you have to do is get 1 to 2% of any nation's population to engage in a kind of moral narrative and moral nonviolent action, and you can transform the direction of that nation. Not 10%, not 15%, not 20%, but if you can just get 1 or 2% to say, wait a minute, close the gate to violence, close the gate to injustice, not on our watch. We may not change everything, but we're not going to be apathetic. We may not change things tomorrow, but if we don't do anything but sow the seeds for what happens. Rosa Parks sat down on a seed that had been sown long ago. And so I don't know, I really don't know, if the work we're trying to do now is the seed or the actual plant that's coming up from other seeds. What I do know is, as for me and my house, there's no other reason for me to be alive than to join with people of all different races, colors, creeds, and sexualities, and non-violently address the violent issues of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and to take on the heresy of religious nationalism, and to be a part of life rather than a part of policies of death.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dan.
I want to thank you so much, Reverend.
Thank you, Dan.
I want to say you are going to sign Some books, right? Okay. So I will remind everybody to come out again. David Harvey and Laura Flanders in a couple weeks. Thanks again to Reverend Barber, and he will stick around to sign some books. Thank you all.
Thank you all.